We were living in Denver, Colorado, in a modest two-story house in the suburbs. It wasn't a mansion, but it was home, a place we'd built together over the years. My wife, Elena, 33, and I, Liam, 35, had been married for 9 years. We had what people would call a picture-perfect relationship on the outside. But inside, cracks had been forming for a while. The breaking point came during what should have been an innocent conversation. We were in the middle of yet another argument, one of those pointless fights that seem to happen more often lately. It started over something trivial, like me asking if she wanted to spend time together that evening. I thought I was being thoughtful, offering to set aside work to focus on us. But instead of a warm response, I got a sharp, dismissive retort. Her voice was flat, like she had rehearsed it. "I don't owe you intimacy," Elena said, crossing her arms and glaring at me like she was daring me to respond. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. "What?" I asked, forcing a nervous laugh. "What does that even mean?" "It means exactly what it sounds like," she snapped. "Just because we're married doesn't mean I owe you anything. I'm tired of you acting like this is some kind of obligation." Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. For 9 years, I'd been pouring everything I had into our marriage, long hours at work, late nights fixing up the house, sacrifices I thought we were both making for a better future. And now she was telling me, point blank, that my feelings and needs didn't matter? That the foundation of our marriage, trust, intimacy, and partnership, was apparently optional? I wanted to argue, to tell her how much she was hurting me. But I couldn't find the words. Instead, I stood there in stunned silence, staring at her as though a stranger had taken over her body. The fight didn't last much longer. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving me with my thoughts racing. That night, I lay awake in our bed, the same bed we'd shared for nearly a decade, replaying her words over and over. By morning, the weight of her words hadn't lifted. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. Had I missed the signs? Was I blind to the cracks in our relationship? Or worse, had I been fooling myself into thinking we were still a team? But as the day wore on, something shifted inside me. Her words, "I don't owe you intimacy," echoed in my head. If that was true, then maybe I didn't owe her the endless sacrifices I'd been making to keep our marriage afloat. I wasn't going to let myself feel like a beggar in my own relationship anymore. I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I started paying closer attention, really observing how we interacted. I noticed how she brushed off my efforts to connect, how dismissive she could be about the things I cared about. It was like she didn't even realize, or didn't care, how little she contributed to the relationship anymore. One night, while sitting in my car outside the house, I found myself reluctant to go inside. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place where I was tolerated, not valued. As I stared at the dark windows, a question I'd been avoiding crept into my mind: what did Elena actually owe me? Respect? Appreciation? Partnership? Or was I just imagining that those were supposed to be part of a marriage? I thought about the early days of our relationship, back when we couldn't get enough of each other. We'd talk until dawn, laugh until our sides hurt, and dream about the future we'd build together. I missed that version of us. But the more I tried to picture it, the more it felt like a distant memory, like a life that belonged to someone else. That night, I didn't go inside right away. I stayed in the car, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to recognize the man looking back at me. What I saw wasn't the optimistic, determined guy Elena married. Instead, I saw someone tired. Tired of giving more than I got. Tired of feeling invisible in my own home. And most of all, tired of chasing after someone who seemed to have stopped caring. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. I didn't ask Elena how her day was. I didn't try to make conversation or keep the peace. I just let the silence linger. She didn't seem to notice at first, she was too busy scrolling through her phone or lost in her own thoughts. But then, a few days later, I got a reaction. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her tone almost accusatory. I shrugged. "Just been busy." She narrowed her eyes at me but didn't push further. "Not yet." I started withdrawing more intentionally. I stopped going out of my way to cook her favorite meals or offer to run errands for her. I stopped trying to fill the silence between us. And slowly, I could see her starting to notice. At first, she tried to poke at me, criticizing little things, like the way I folded laundry or how I didn't refill the gas tank. But instead of taking the bait, I let her words roll off me. I wasn't playing that game anymore. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Elena came home with a small bag from a bakery downtown. She handed me a box with a quiet, almost hesitant, "I thought you might like this." Inside was a slice of carrot cake, my favorite. I wanted to believe it was a peace offering, but something about it felt calculated. Like she was testing the waters, trying to gauge how far I'd pulled away. I thanked her but didn't let it spark a bigger conversation. I needed to know if her effort was real, or just a band-aid over a wound she didn't want to acknowledge. A week later, the tension in the house was palpable. We were like two magnets, constantly repelling each other yet still stuck in the same orbit. Every interaction felt forced, every word loaded with unspoken meaning. And then, one night, it all came to a head. I had just come home from work, exhausted but determined to stick to my new routine: minimal interaction, no unnecessary conversation. Elena was already in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She barely glanced up as I walked in. I went straight to the kitchen, grabbed a drink, and sat at the dining table in silence. After a few minutes, she spoke. "Are you mad at me?" Her question caught me off guard. I looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time in what felt like days. "Mad at you?" I said, my voice calm but firm. "No. I'm just done trying harder than you." Her face froze, as though she hadn't expected me to say it out loud. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her tone defensive. "It means exactly what it sounds like," I replied. "I've spent years pouring everything I have into this marriage, working overtime, making sacrifices, trying to keep us together. And what do I get in return? You telling me you don't owe me intimacy? You acting like I'm some kind of inconvenience in your life?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "That's not fair. I've been dealing with my own stress, you wouldn't understand. You're twisting this into something it's not." "I'm not twisting anything," I shot back. "I'm just done pretending that this is a partnership when it's not. I'm done being the only one who tries." She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "You don't know what it's been like for me, Liam. You think everything is so black and white, but it's not. I never wanted things to get this way." "Then why didn't you say something?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why did you let it get to this point? Do you have any idea how it feels to come home every day and feel like a stranger in your own house?" She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, I added, "You said you don't owe me intimacy. Fine. But let me make one thing clear, I don't owe you the version of myself that has been breaking his back to hold this marriage together. Not anymore." For the first time, I saw something crack in her expression: fear. Her anger seemed to evaporate, replaced by uncertainty. She sat back down on the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know how we got here," she whispered. "Neither do I," I said, my voice softer now. "But I do know that something has to change. Because I can't keep living like this." That night, I didn't sleep in our bedroom. I grabbed a pillow and a blanket and moved to the guest room. It wasn't a grand gesture or an attempt to make her feel guilty. I just needed space, a physical boundary to match the emotional distance that had been growing between us. The next few days were eerily quiet. Elena tried to break the silence a few times, but I wasn't ready to talk. Instead, I focused on figuring out what I wanted, what I needed. For so long, I'd been bending over backward to make her happy, to meet her needs, that I'd forgotten about my own. It was during one of those quiet evenings, as I sat in the guest room scrolling through my phone, that I stumbled across an old photo of us. It was from our first anniversary, taken at a little restaurant downtown. In the picture, we were smiling, holding hands, and leaning into each other like nothing else in the world mattered. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the couple in the photo with the strangers we had become. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep waiting for Elena to change. If she wanted to save our marriage, she needed to show me, not with words or gestures, but with real effort. And if she couldn't, or wouldn't, I had to be ready to walk away. The silence between us stretched into a week. Elena's attempts to reach out became more frequent. She'd leave little notes on the counter, text me during the day, or make my favorite meals, but I didn't respond in the way I once would have. Her efforts felt too little, too late. I needed more than small gestures, I needed real accountability, real change. One evening, I came home to find Elena pacing the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She looked up as I walked in, and I could see the tension in her face. She had rehearsed this moment. "We need to talk," she said firmly. I sighed, setting my bag down on the counter. "All right. Talk." Her voice wavered, but she pushed through. "I can't keep living like this, Liam. The distance, the silence, it's killing me." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "The silence is killing you now? Funny, you didn't seem to mind it when it was me feeling invisible in this house for years." Her expression twisted into something between guilt and frustration. "That's not fair. I've been trying, Liam. I've been trying to fix things, but you're not giving me a chance." I laughed bitterly. "Trying? You mean buying me carrot cake and texting me, 'We need to talk'? That's not trying, Elena. That's damage control." She flinched at my words but didn't back down. "I've been going to therapy. I've been working on myself. I'm trying to understand where I went wrong." "And what have you figured out?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She hesitated, her eyes darting away. "I figured out that I've been selfish. That I've taken you for granted." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. But then she added, "But you've been distant too. You've shut me out. How am I supposed to fix this when you won't even meet me halfway?" "Halfway?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Elena, I've been walking 90% of the way for 9 years. All I ever wanted was for you to meet me at the last 10%. And instead, you stood there, watching me struggle, and told me you don't owe me anything." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she was going to cry. But instead, she straightened her shoulders, her jaw tightening. "So, what? Are you saying it's over?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at her, really looked at her, and tried to see the woman I had fallen in love with. But all I saw was someone I barely recognized. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know that I can't keep doing this cycle of fighting, apologizing, and pretending everything's fine. It's not fine, Elena. It hasn't been fine for a long time." That night, I packed a bag. Elena stood in the hallway, watching me, tears streaming down her face. She didn't try to stop me, but she didn't say goodbye either. As I walked out the door, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a strange sense of freedom. I checked into the Cedarwood Inn, a small, quiet hotel on the edge of town. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough, a place where I could breathe and think without the weight of her expectations pressing down on me. The first night was strange. I sat on the bed, staring at my phone, half expecting her to call or text. But when nothing came, I felt an odd sense of clarity. For so long, I had tied my worth to her approval, her happiness. Now, for the first time, I was alone with my own thoughts, my own needs. The next few days passed in a blur. I went to work, came back to the hotel, and tried to piece together what I wanted from my life. Elena called once, late at night, but I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to face her yet. On the fourth day, she sent me a long text. It wasn't an apology, it was a confession. She admitted to feeling lost, to not knowing how to be a partner, to letting her own insecurities and fears push me away. She asked if we could try counseling together, if we could at least talk before making any final decisions. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "I'll think about it." Elena's text stayed with me over the next few days. I wanted to believe her words were genuine, that she was finally taking responsibility for her role in the breakdown of our marriage. But trust doesn't rebuild overnight, and I wasn't ready to let my guard down just because she'd admitted fault. A week after leaving, I agreed to meet her. We decided on neutral ground, a small cafe downtown where we'd had one of our first dates years ago. As I sat at the table, waiting for her to arrive, I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and apprehension. The cafe looked the same, but I was a different man now, and she was no longer the girl who made me laugh until my sides hurt. She arrived a few minutes late, her eyes puffy as though she'd been crying. She sat across from me, clutching her coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Thanks for meeting me," she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the hum of the cafe. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. She took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything I said and did. And I realize now how much I hurt you." Her words felt sincere, but I was wary. "Go on," I said. Elena hesitated, then continued. "I don't know why I pushed you away. Maybe it was fear, or maybe I just didn't know how to be vulnerable anymore. But I see it now, Liam. I see how much you gave, and I'm sorry I didn't give back." For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of the woman I had fallen in love with. But one apology wasn't enough to erase the years of resentment and neglect. "I'm glad you're starting to understand," I said carefully. "But you need to know that this isn't something we can fix overnight. Words aren't enough, Elena. You have to show me that you're willing to put in the work, real work, to rebuild what's left." "I want to," she said quickly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Her eagerness was almost overwhelming, but I forced myself to stay grounded. "Then we start with counseling," I said. "Both of us. Together." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Okay. Counseling. Whatever it takes." We started attending sessions with a marriage counselor the following week. The therapist, Dr. Bennett, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. From the beginning, she made it clear that healing would require honesty, effort, and patience from both of us. The sessions were brutal at first. Dr. Bennett had a way of cutting through our defenses, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths. Elena admitted to feeling disconnected long before our fights began but confessed she hadn't known how to communicate her feelings. I admitted my own flaws, how I had ignored the signs, assuming my sacrifices were enough to sustain us without addressing the underlying issues. One session, however, revealed something I hadn't been prepared for. It was near the end of the hour when Dr. Bennett asked, "Elena, what do you think triggered this breakdown in your marriage? Was there a specific moment or event?" Elena looked down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "There was someone else," she whispered. The words hit me like a freight train. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't an affair. Nothing physical happened. But I started talking to someone at work," a coworker. It started out innocent, but it became emotional. I think that's when I started pulling away from you. My mind raced. I felt anger, betrayal, and a deep, aching sadness. Why didn't you tell me this before? I managed to ask. I didn't want to hurt you, she said, her voice breaking. And I didn't think it mattered because it ended before anything could happen. Dar. Bennett intervened, her calm voice cutting through the tension. This is an important moment. Liam, you're allowed to feel hurt and angry. Elena, you need to understand the weight of what you've just shared. I sat there, stunned, as Elena sobbed beside me. I had come into counseling hoping for clarity, but instead, I found myself questioning everything all over again. That night, I didn't go back to the house. I returned to the Cedarwood Inn, where I sat on the bed, staring at the wall. The revelation about the emotional affair felt like the final nail in the coffin. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the secrecy, the lies by omission, the knowledge that I had been fighting for a marriage where I didn't even know the full truth. Elena texted me late that night, "I'm sorry. Please don't shut me out. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." I didn't respond. Over the next few days, I wrestled with what to do. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to believe that we could rebuild from the wreckage. But another part of me knew that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair. In the end, the decision wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches or tearful goodbyes. I filed for separation a month later, and Elena didn't fight it. Walking away hurt, but it also brought me a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, I was choosing myself. The separation process was quiet, almost clinical. Elena and I divided our assets without much argument. She stayed in the house, while I found a small apartment closer to downtown Denver. I didn't want the house, it felt too heavy with memories, both good and bad. For the first few weeks, I felt untethered. After spending nearly a decade building a life with someone, it was strange to be entirely on my own. Simple things like cooking dinner or coming home to an empty apartment felt foreign. But gradually, I began to adjust. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I had pushed aside during my marriage because I was too focused on Elena. It was awkward at first, catching up after years of silence, but most of them welcomed me back without judgment. I also threw myself into hobbies I'd abandoned, like hiking in the Rockies and photography. Being in nature, capturing its beauty through my camera lens, gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Occasionally, Elena and I would exchange polite texts, things about paperwork or the logistics of separation, but the emotional conversations were over. She tried once to reopen the door, sending me a long message about how she had continued therapy and was working on herself, but I didn't reply. It wasn't out of anger, I just didn't have anything left to give. About 3 months after the separation was finalized, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years. Her name was Rachel, an old friend from college. We bumped into each other at a bookstore, of all places. She recognized me first and called out my name, her smile warm and familiar. We ended up grabbing coffee and catching up. Rachel had moved back to Denver after living in Chicago for several years. She was working as an event planner and seemed genuinely happy with her life. I found myself relaxing in her company, laughing in a way I hadn't in months. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I began meeting more often, not as a romantic prospect, but as two friends reconnecting. She didn't pry about my divorce, though I eventually told her the broad strokes of the story. She listened without judgment, offering only support and understanding. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Looking back, I realized my marriage hadn't failed all at once, it had been eroding for years, little by little. It wasn't just Elena's fault, though her emotional withdrawal and dishonesty played a significant role. I had my own blind spots, my own inability to address the growing distance until it was too late. But I also realized something else: leaving wasn't a failure. It was a choice to prioritize my happiness and my well-being. I had spent so many years trying to save a relationship that I forgot to save myself. One day, while unpacking a box in my new apartment, I found an old photo of Elena and me. It was from our wedding day, our faces full of hope, our smiles unguarded. I stared at it for a long moment before tucking it back into the box. That chapter of my life was over, but it didn't mean it hadn't mattered. It just meant it was time to move on. Now, 6 months later, I feel lighter. Life isn't perfect, but it feels like mine again. Rachel and I are still friends, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something more starting to bloom between us. For now, I'm taking things slow, learning to rebuild trust, not just in others, but in myself. Elena is still a part of my story, a chapter that shaped who I am today. But she's not my ending. I've come to understand that some relationships are meant to teach us, not last forever. And that's okay. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Love isn't about sacrifice, it's about balance. And when that balance is gone, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go. For the first time in years, I feel free. And that, I think, is a good place to start.